Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, a podcast about early American history with Liz Covart. The study of history is key to understanding who we are and how we can affect a better future. Ben Franklin's World will introduce you to historical people and events that have impacted and shaped our present-day world. And now, here's your host, Liz Covart.
Hello, and welcome to episode 51 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. What comes to mind when I say Detroit? Cars? Professional sports teams? Rust Belt City? All of those images are accurate, of course, but they're modern images. Detroit actually has a really long American history, a history that starts with its role as a trading place for Native American peoples. Its Euro-American history also dates back pretty far, to 1701, when the Sieur de Cadillac established a settlement for French fur traders. Today, we explore the early history of Detroit with Catherine Cangany, an associate professor of history at the University of Notre Dame and the author of Frontier Seaport, Detroit's Transformation into an Atlantic Entrepôt. During our exploration, Catherine reveals details about the settlement of Detroit by the French in 1701, the Native American communities around Detroit and their relationships with the French colonists, and Detroit's transition from a French fur trading post to a British fur trading post to an American city. Are you ready to visit early Detroit and learn more about its fascinating history? Let's go meet our guide.
With tidings and wisdom to share about our early American past, here is this week's special guest.
Today's guest is an associate professor of history at the University of Notre Dame. Her research interests focus on the economies, cultures, and material cultures of the French and British Atlantic worlds during the 17th and 18th centuries. Our guest has also just published her first book, Frontier Seaport, Detroit's Transformation into an Atlantic Entrepôt. Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, Catherine Cangany.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here.
Catherine, before we dive into the early history of Detroit, I have to know something. Was there ever a point when you were working on this project that someone asked you about your work and you said, yes, I'm working on the early history of Detroit, and then they took a step back and looked at you and said, Detroit? Like, what interesting things happened in Detroit?
Oh, yes, all the time. In fact, it began with my dissertation committee when I floated the idea. Detroit is an unusual topic for colonial Americanists to work on, although thankfully now it is getting a little bit more scholarly attention. But we don't tend to think about what was going on beyond the eastern seaboard in the 17th and 18th centuries, so most certainly it was unusual.
I knew we were kindred spirits because my project looks at Albany and I say Albany and they're like, it's not New York City, it's not Boston. Like, why would you study Albany, New York? But it's the same thing. It's a very interesting place. And like Detroit, a lot of fascinating stuff goes on there. They're like these big entrepôts in the middle of nowhere.
And in fact, thoroughly connected to what was going on the eastern seaboard and further afield. So not at all the insular, backward places that we tend to imagine them to have been.
Let's get into it. Let's explore just how interconnected Detroit was and how interesting it really is. Let's start at the beginning. Would you tell us about why the Sieur de Cadillac settled Detroit in 1701?
Location, location, location. The geography of Detroit really would have been hard to beat in 1701 when he founded it. The word Detroit is an anglicization of the French word détroit, which means of the strait, and it refers to the Detroit River, which connects Lakes Huron and Erie. On the Erie side, it's a direct connection. On the Huron side, you go through Lake St. Clair and the St. Clair River, but nonetheless, it connects two of the five Great Lakes, and the other three were within reach. So the location was phenomenal. The Great Lakes and rivers in this period were the transportation of the 18th century. So from that standpoint, Detroit was easily accessible to the places that the French Empire wanted to go. The other reason that it was so strategic was it was within reach of a number of native groups in the interior, and France's empire in North America, aside from the Caribbean sugar islands, was really focused on the fur trade. So it was also a way to compete with the British and reach groups that the British had not been interacting with up to that point. The land that Detroit was founded on seemed to Cadillac to be vacant, which of course it wasn't. It was used seasonally by a number of native groups, including as far away as the Iroquois in New York. But nonetheless, it seemed to him to be available land. And so that vacant quality was really key for sustaining his vision of founding a city where the French and various native groups would literally live and work together.
Speaking of the native peoples that lived around Detroit, Janine would like to know more about them and what their relations were like with the people of Detroit once Euro-Americans started settling there.
That's a great question. Mostly we're talking about Algonquian speakers, and of that language group, most predominantly we're talking about the Anishinaabe, that is, the Odawas, the Ojibways, and the Potawatomis. But there were also some Iroquoian speakers in the area, most notably the Hurons. So after Cadillac founded the city in 1701, he reached out to a number of these native groups who were within a few hundred miles of the area, encouraging them to relocate. So bands of Odawas arrived by 1703, Hurons by 1704, Potawatomis sometime from 1712 to 1714, Ojibways in 1718, and then there were also smaller bands of other groups, including Abenakis, Miamis, Mississaugas, and for a short time, even some of the Wisconsin tribes, Meskwakis, which are also known as the Sauk Foxes, Mascoutins, and Loups. So he reached out to a number of different groups, and they answered his call. So a number of those groups had long-standing alliances with one another, and others had histories of conflict. So at times, early Detroit was a very volatile place to live, and most notably we see this during the First Fox War, which took place from 1712 to 1716, which essentially was pitting the Michigan-based tribes against those Wisconsin newcomers. So when these various groups settled in Detroit, and I should also add here that if you're familiar with Richard White's middle ground argument, which says that the native peoples in the Great Lakes region were forced to negotiate with each other because they were literally sandwiched between two powerful tribes, which is to say the Iroquois to the east and the Sioux to the west. So because they were sandwiched together, no room to get away from those two groups, they were forced to interact and to accommodate one another. So in theory, it sounds like Cadillac's vision would work because these groups were forced to work with one another. But in reality, there were several Detroits in the early period. So the Hurons had their own settlement, Potawatomis had theirs, Ojibways had theirs, the French had theirs. So one scholar has likened early Detroit to a collection of distinct ethnic enclaves. So in close proximity with one another, but also literally separated. And I should also say that the reason that the middle ground relationship continued after the arrival of the French at Detroit in 1701 was precisely because the French form of colonization was, we might say, less coercive than the British or Spanish forms. Not to say that it couldn't still be very brutal, because it was, but they realized that they could use native peoples to further their imperial aims instead of working against them. So we see at Detroit from the very beginning economic cooperation between these various native groups and the French, and we also see intermarriage, we see political diplomacy, but we also see simmering racial tensions and upwellings of violence.
You mentioned economic cooperation. What does the economy of early Detroit look like?
It is overwhelmingly about the fur trade, and that would continue to be true really until the twilight of the French period. The British came in 1760, and then we really start to see economic expansion. But in the French period, it's almost exclusively about the fur trade. So French voyageurs would travel from places outside of Detroit to Detroit, often resupplying, even occasionally overwintering at Detroit before moving further inland to trade goods with native peoples for furs and skins. So Detroit actually became saturated with the goods of empire from its founding, and mostly those goods of empire initially were trade goods, but nonetheless surprising things to find 600 miles from the coast.
It sounds like we have two Detroits, Native American Detroit and French Detroit. Do these Detroits intermix? Are Native Americans and Detroiters adopting aspects of one another's culture?
Absolutely. Cultural exchange is the hallmark of the fur trade. So the various kinds of goods, European manufactured goods that were coming into Detroit for a native clientele were things like textiles, beads, jewelry, cooking utensils, weapons, alcohol, etc. And historians have talked a lot about how Native peoples absorbed particular aspects of European culture through the use of these trade goods, and also the manners that often accompanied those trade goods. And the changes that occurred to Native lifeways, whether to hunting, fighting, cooking, practicing settled agriculture, and so on, often with devastating consequences by virtue of adopting those kinds of goods. So there's a rich literature on that part of the story. There's a burgeoning literature on how Native peoples used European trade goods in their own ways. So archaeologically, we find many examples of things like copper pots having been dismantled by Native peoples and turned into jewelry and other kinds of ornaments. So there's a way in which Native peoples used a European-made object for their own purposes, and often imbuing those pieces of jewelry with spiritual significance. And then there's a tinier literature that talks about how the exchanges of the fur trade also influenced Europeans, that is to say, how Europeans borrowed elements of native culture. So one of the things that I have worked on is moccasins and how this native shoe first came to be worn by French colonists and then eventually manufactured by them. And as the 18th century wore on, Native peoples were increasingly eclipsed in that process. So by the end of the 18th century, the manufacturing of moccasins at Detroit for an overwhelmingly white clientele was handled pretty much start to finish by white colonists. So a really interesting way that colonists appropriated a native cultural practice, changed it around, cut them out of the process, and still imagined it to have been an authentically native good.
Did Detroiters do the same with wampum? They do that a lot in Albany. They have, Dutch and English settlers there actually making the wampum to trade, which was a traditional native good.
Yes. So the kind of faux wampum that would have been produced was known as porcelain, and initially Native peoples were not interested in using porcelain because wampum, again, not only is a currency, it often has diplomatic and spiritual significance, and the faux wampum, the porcelain that Dutch and French manufacturers were making, was considered inferior. But again, as the colonial period wore on, Native peoples began to see the decorative value, if not the diplomatic and spiritual value of porcelain. And so we find it being used, again, in different kinds of ways than it was originally intended by these European manufacturers to have been used.
What happens to these several Detroits when the British move in 1760, but officially in 1763 at the end of the French and Indian War? What happens to these communities?
So I'll start with what happens with the French and then talk about what happens to these various native communities. When the British took over in 1760, it was, for the French colonists, a surprisingly easy transition. They had to take an oath of allegiance, of course, to the British Empire. But aside from that, daily life really remained unchanged. The French colonists retained ownership of their land. They continued to speak French, to practice Catholicism, to use French civil law, and also to uphold their trading relationships with these various native groups in the area. By contrast, it was a very difficult transition for native peoples, and this is really for two reasons. First of all, one of the best strategies that native peoples had in this era for combating colonialism was to play off imperial powers against one another. And that strategy, of course, vanished with the departure of the French. So native peoples now were forced to deal with the British and had no real other recourse for trade except to interact with them. And the second reason that it proved such a difficult transition for native peoples was because the British were also aware that this strategy was no longer in play. And so they discontinued long-standing diplomatic practices like gift-giving because they realized that there was no alternative for Native peoples if they wanted to trade. So the discontinuance of gift-giving had devastating consequences for those long-standing relationships that Native peoples had counted on with area whites. For the settlement itself, though, probably the biggest change that came with the arrival of the British in 1760 was economic. And the economic system that had been begun by the French, which is to say mostly that fur trade economy, really blossomed under the British period. As the settlement was opened up to British colonists arriving, we see a number of British fur trade merchants descend on the town. They came from elsewhere in the British Empire, and they brought those long-standing economic connections of their own to Detroit. So we suddenly see, after 1760, a real increase in the types of commerce going on in town. We see the retailing of non-fur trade goods, so we see goods meant for a settled, agriculturally practicing kind of community. And those ties to the Atlantic world also multiplied and tightened with the arrival of the British in 1760.
I'd like to explore those ties to the Atlantic world, but before we move on from this transition, was Pontiac's Rebellion a part of the difficult transition Native American peoples had between French and British trading partners and neighbors?
Absolutely it was. The Odawa leader Pontiac was inspired by the Delaware prophet Neolin, and Neolin had a number of visions which called for a complete return to traditional ways. That is to say, a doing away with all kinds of interactions with Europeans and Euro-Americans. Pontiac's vision was actually more tempered. He had a long history of dealing with the French and dealing with the French in some positive ways, and so his vision actually called for a return to the French imperial system, no longer interacting with the British, but a return to life before 1760. So in 1763, he and a number of his supporters stormed the British fort at Detroit during the summer and fall of that year, and it touched off a number of other attacks by Native peoples on British forts in the area west of the Appalachians. And although those attacks seem to have been coordinated, they were not, in fact, orchestrated by Pontiac himself, inspired by him, but not orchestrated by him, which is why scholars tend to call this conflict the war called Pontiac's, because we often imagine him to have been the overarching leader of this movement, and in fact, he was just one piece of it. The siege on Fort Detroit in 1763 ended in a stalemate about nearly 6 months after it had started, when Pontiac and his supporters withdrew to the Illinois country to regroup. And so another consequence for Native peoples that we see after the arrival of the British is that many of them retreated with Pontiac to Illinois after 1763. Now, this, of course, is not to say that Native peoples were gone after Pontiac's failed siege at Detroit, not at all, but just that they became less visible and perhaps we might say less threatening to the British population that remained after that siege ended.
Earlier you mentioned that Detroit had strong ties to the Atlantic world. Would you tell us about those ties, what they meant for the people who lived in Detroit, and when those ties started?
So the economic ties to the Atlantic world began at Detroit instantaneously with its founding as a result of the fur trade. The fur trade is a global kind of economy. The raw skins and furs that were collected at Detroit and then shipped eastward to France and later to London were turned into finished articles like gloves and hats, some of which returned to North America, but a larger portion of them went further east. So we find goods made up of North American furs as far away as Russia and China. So from the beginning, Detroiters were plugged into a very global kind of economy. And because of the influx of merchants, particularly with the beginning of the British system in 1763, what we might call transnational goods began to flood the Detroit marketplace. So even though Detroit was 600 miles inland, at this point, the means of getting people and goods and information to Detroit mostly relies on a network of canoes and bateaus, portaging where bodies of water don't meet. That might even be up to 30 miles of portaging at a time. Despite all of those hardships, we find very delicate and expensive goods like porcelain, scientific instruments, tea, expensive textiles like silk in Detroit from the middle of the 18th century on. So in terms of the kinds of goods that Detroiters were using and the ways in which they were using them, it looks very much like any other port town around the Atlantic world in this period.
Transportation must have been a major issue, because you're talking about portaging, which is the act of actually lifting your canoe or bateau out of the water and carrying it with you to the next place where you can put it back in the water. You have to get these goods to Detroit in one piece, and things are just so isolated. Roads really stink. So what was the most standard method of transportation to Detroit, and did it suffer from the same sorts of weather conditions that other inland communities had to deal with?
There were two main routes from the St. Lawrence River into Detroit in this period. There was the northern route and the southern route, and it depended which way around the Great Lakes you wished to travel. So the northern route would take you up by Michilimackinac at the tip of the lower peninsula of Michigan, and then south to Detroit. The southern route would come up through Lake Erie and up the Detroit River into Detroit that way. Either way that you went, it was an enormously difficult journey. It took a number of weeks. It was a seasonal undertaking. Detroit was isolated from the east for up to 6 months out of each year because of the harsh winter. And to go back to something we were talking about a few moments ago, when Detroiters were making moccasins for a white clientele in the third quarter of the 18th century, they began shipping them outside of Detroit and most predominantly to the East Coast, although we see them circulating around the Great Lakes also. And a number of merchants would comment on the difficulty of getting those shoes to the East Coast in one piece because they were dependent on things like river levels. And so there were times in which a cargo of shoes leaving Detroit would arrive in the East Coast not saleable because of the conditions encountered in just transporting that merchandise to its final destination.
I know we haven't gotten to the point where Detroit becomes American, but spoiler alert, Detroit becomes an American possession. What does it mean for Detroiters when the Erie Canal opens on October 26, 1825?
So in 1796, Detroit became an American city, an American territory, and that was quite a late transition into becoming part of the United States. With the Treaty of Paris that was signed at the end of the American Revolution in 1783, one of the provisions that the British Empire made was a promise to vacate its western forts, which of course it didn't end up doing. These were too valuable in terms of the fur trade. They were too valuable in terms of potentially mounting a campaign to take back the 13 colonies, but also the United States was too young and too poor of a country to really enforce that provision. So even though on paper in 1783 Detroit became part of the United States, it didn't actually happen until 1796, and that was as a result of the 1794 Jay Treaty, which was overwhelmingly orchestrated by Alexander Hamilton and John Jay, extracting that promise from the British to vacate those western forts, including Detroit, which they finally did 2 years later in 1796. So the transition into becoming an American entity, ironically, was a more painful one than it had been in 1760 transitioning to the British. And it was also a more unwelcome one. This was an imperial power that was much nearer by. In fact, the period of salutary neglect, where the empires believed that a hands-off approach to Detroit would actually allow it to flourish best. And that was the economic doctrine that prevailed during the French and British periods. But under the American period, beginning in 1796, salutary neglect was no longer the course of the day. also, Detroiters experienced much more day-to-day monitoring, much less tolerance for the autonomous practices that they had been accustomed to undertaking under the French and British periods. But we do see in the American period a continuing flourishing of the economy, and that's especially due to what you just mentioned, the opening of the Erie Canal in 1825-26. And that not only made it easier for goods to come in and out of Detroit, eliminating some of those most difficult and long portages, it also allowed immigration to pick up speed. We see after 1826 what was locally known as Michigan fever. Yankees, particularly from the New York area, anxious to migrate west to Michigan, acquire large tracts of land and set up farms and other kinds of economic practices. So the opening of the Erie Canal not only allowed many more people to come settle the Detroit area, it also allowed for things like manufacturing to increase. So we see after the opening of the canal, Detroit getting into different kinds of manufactured goods, most notably first stoves in the mid to late 19th century, and then in the turn of the 20th century transitioning to automobiles, and then during World War II into armaments. And that's all related to the ease with which things could be made and moved in the Detroit area.
I came to my study of Albany because I was fascinated by why everyone outside of New England seemed to think that New York was part of the region. As a New Englander, I was a little offended, but I'm now over it. And the short answer is because after the Revolution, 700 to 800,000 New Englanders move into New York and set up new New England towns. And one author has dubbed New York the second New England, but another author has dubbed Michigan the third New England. So could you talk about what happens when the Erie Canal opens, or even before when the Yankees start flooding in? What are the Yankees doing in Michigan? How are they living? How are they setting up their towns? And what does that mean for Detroit?
The Yankees that came in after the opening of the Erie Canal in 1826 set up life to look much as it had in New York and then previous to that in New England. So aside from the fact that there are a number of communities in Michigan named after places and people in New York, we see a kind of Americanization of Detroit happening with their arrival. We see increased racial tensions between the long-standing French and British populations and these newcomers. We see trade routes being modified in part because these newcomers from New York wanted to make use of their economic connections back home. So we see a rerouting of trade in this period in part because the people who arrive in Detroit and who are participating in that trade want to use those long-standing connections that they had fostered back east. We might also talk about what Detroit looks like in terms of a legal entity or a political entity. When the British vacated in 1796, Detroit had been part of one administrative body that straddled the Detroit River, and that's Windsor, Ontario. And for Detroit's entire history, its chief trading partners up to 1796 had been Windsor as well as Montreal and Quebec City. And these three trading partners not only were close by and reachable by these waterways, but also they were part of the same empire as Detroit. So it really facilitated this kind of trade. When the Americans came in 1796, Detroit suddenly was part of a different empire, and thus trade between Detroit and Windsor and Montreal and Quebec City became increasingly monitored but also regulated. And Detroit saw its first collector of customs appointed in 1800. So in the early 19th century, we see a lot of the same legal and political frameworks being set up in Detroit that we would have seen several decades earlier elsewhere in America, and particularly in New York and in New England. And this transition into an American legal framework and political framework was a really difficult one at Detroit. I mentioned in 1796, Detroit had been part of this entity that straddled the Detroit River. That, of course, was severed with the arrival of the British. And so merchants in particular spent the next 15 years trying to get Detroit recognized as its own legal and political entity, because when Detroit joined the United States in 1796, it was lumped into the Northwest Territory with Ohio, Indiana, and so on. So the autonomy that it had experienced, especially under the British period, was gone. And so in terms of debt resolution, in terms of settling major kinds of disputes, Detroiters had to journey to the seat of the Northwest Territory to get those resolved. So it started out when they first joined in 1796 being Cincinnati. It was moved to Chillicothe in 1800, so further and further away in Ohio to get these disputes resolved. So Detroiters began campaigning vigorously in the early 19th century for a system, especially a judicial system, that was akin to what you would find elsewhere in the United States. And so initially they were, when Ohio was split off the territory, the Northwest Territory, in 1803 to become its own state, unfortunately for Detroit, it was lumped in with the Indiana Territory, which represented another step back because the territorial seat of the Indiana Territory was down in Vincennes in southern Indiana, so even further away to go to resolve disputes. So it wasn't until finally in 1805, when the Michigan Territory was formed and Detroit then was its capital, do we finally see a legal system and a political system much more akin in Detroit to what we would find in New York and elsewhere. But it was a long and difficult battle to get that kind of recognition.
It seems like the Americans get Detroit and they either don't realize what Detroit is or they don't know how to deal with it. I wonder if this has anything to do with the fact that at least Detroit is not connected to a land company. Earlier, when we spoke with Colin Calloway, he mentioned that, at least in Ohio, the reason that there's battles, the reason that the American government is willing to send an army out to fight the Native Americans for the land is because many of the congressmen have either their hands in the pockets of a New England land company or, powerful friends that have their hands in the pockets of the New England land company. Is that the case, or are they just really clueless for another reason?
It's a little bit of both. They're sort of, you're caught in the moment before the American Fur Company really is coming to power in the area. So yes, there is a little bit of a vacuum there. But also, the laws on the books, especially the laws regarding commerce and international commerce, patently did not apply to the Great Lakes in this period. So the expectations that the federal government had about what international commerce looked like, the kinds of vessels used, the kinds of goods being transported, the quantities of those goods, the process of taking them across international lines just don't work in the Great Lakes. The Detroit River is 1 mile across, and that separates the United States at Detroit from Canada, from Ontario, from particularly Windsor. So international commerce across a body of water that's 1 mile wide is very different from international commerce going across the Atlantic Ocean. And it took the United States federal government many decades to begin amending their registering and coasting laws, begin amending maritime law, begin amending international trade laws to reflect the geography and the historical peculiarities of life in the Great Lakes.
I have to imagine that one of the peculiarities of living on the Great Lakes is Detroit was once British. They're trading with their neighbors in Canada that are just across the Detroit River. What happens to that trade when the Americans move in? Are they still allowed to trade with the British Empire just across the river, or did the Americans put a kibosh to that?
They were still allowed to trade across the river, although it was discouraged because those trade connections that we talked about a few minutes ago with New York were the ones that were privileged after 1796. So the federal government attempted to crack down on this trans-river commerce to force Detroit merchants to deal with New York merchants and also Pennsylvania merchants, but especially New York in this period. But that kind of trans-river commerce had existed for a century before the federal government attempted to regulate it. And so in the space between 1796 and 1800, when Detroit's first collector of customs was appointed, trade continued just as it had under the French and British periods, back and forth across the river, and it was basically unmonitored. And because no one was monitoring it or enforcing it or levying taxes against it, Detroiters found themselves under the impression that it was allowed to continue. And so when in 1800 that first collector of customs was appointed, trade then became a markedly different beast. And we see after 1800 the rise of what I call staples smuggling occurring back and forth across the river. So whereas we often see in other cases of smuggling luxury goods, rare goods, those kinds of things being traded illegally, what we see at Detroit is staple goods, everyday kinds of objects, pork, apples, and those kinds of locally produced, mostly agricultural produce. And this was not so much an attempt to flout the U.S. government as it was to continue those economic ties that had been in place for a century, because although the arrival of the U.S. government bisected the Detroit River, making the northern part, which is the Detroit side, American, and the southern part, which is Ontario, part of British Canada, the fact was that businesses and families straddled that river and had for decades. And so it wasn't just they wanted to continue the easiest trade routes. They also wanted to continue doing business with their kin networks, which had been in place for many decades.
We've talked a lot about Detroit as an economic and cultural space, but I wonder about the physical space as well. In Frontier Seaport, you talk about the Great Fire of 1805 and how it changed the landscape. Would you tell us about the fire and how it did alter Detroit?
Detroit burned to the ground in the course of about 6 hours on June 11th, 1805. It was a fire that started in the stable behind the town bakehouse, and if this sounds very familiar, it's because most American metropolises burned, if not once, several times, exactly by things like this, a fire in the stable that gets out of control. And so because Detroit in 1805 was mostly a wooden city, in the course of 6 hours, it was mostly gone. And so no edifices remained inside the fort except for one blockhouse, which is quite mysterious because that blockhouse was made of wood. And except for the outlying farmhouses, most of the homes were destroyed. The entire military citadel was gone. All of the military stores were gone. So it was a disaster on an enormous scale, and it swept away with it most of the visual reminders of the French and British periods. So for those long-standing residents, it was devastating. For those newly arrived American residents and also those in the U.S. Congress, it presented a remarkable opportunity to turn Detroit into the American metropolis that it now was. And so by rebuilding the city in an American style, they could then erase a lot of its foreign past. And Augustus B. Woodward, who was one of Detroit's first territorial judges, put himself in charge of attempting to rebuild the city in an American style, and he was quite enamored with the work of Pierre L'Enfant, who laid out Washington, D.C., and so used some of L'Enfant's principles to design a new plan for Detroit, which was of repeating hexagons. And so it's mind-blowing to think about what Detroit would have looked like today if this plan had been fully implemented. But the idea was that it was infinitely expandable. It was well-suited to Detroit's flat terrain. And it was something very modern and American in feel. And ironically, of course, L'Enfant was a French-American born in France, so it's perhaps not that far of a return from what Detroit had looked like in its colonial period. Ultimately, though, Woodward's plan was abandoned 25 years after the fire because Detroit's French and British populations absolutely refused to allow the city to be rebuilt in such a different style. They wanted a return to the rectilinear layout that had characterized it in the colonial era. Now, they made some concessions. They agreed that the streets were too narrow, that the blocks were too short, so it was an expansion of the original kind of layout, but they absolutely would not put up with Americans coming in and changing the look of the city. In fact, they used a number of tactics, rumor, sabotage among them, to ensure that Woodward's plan was foiled. And ultimately, they won. If you look at the layout of Detroit today, you'll notice that with one small exception, which is about half of one of the main hexagons, all of Detroit now is rectilinear blocks.
Before we move into the time warp, I have to note, your book was great, and it was very succinct, and it was less than 200 pages or around 200 pages. So I have to believe there were many fascinating stories that you just didn't include in your book. Could you tell us maybe about one of the fascinating stories that you had to cut for your book, but that most people don't know about Detroit?
So in 1845, the historian Francis Parkman came to Detroit. He had just finished his first year of law school at Harvard and was conducting research on what would become his second book, The Conspiracy of Pontiac. And if you've read The Conspiracy of Pontiac, which was first published in 1856, it's a very odd book. It's part ethnography, it's part history, and it's also part portrait of Pontiac. Parkman was particularly interested in Pontiac the man and uncovering his persona. So he journeyed to Detroit to conduct some oral histories with the descendants of the French families who had known Pontiac and interacted with him in the 1760s, which is rather remarkable. We tend to think about oral histories being a very modern kind of historical tool, and yet here we have an example of Parkman doing it in the 19th century. Well, one of the French descendants that he spoke with while he was there in 1845 was John R. Williams, who then was serving as the mayor of Detroit. And Williams was also a descendant of the Campots, one of the most powerful French families in Detroit. So Williams was motivated both in terms of his political agenda and his personal family history, to meet with Parkman and to help restore French people's centrality to the history of Detroit and particularly to Pontiac's siege. So Williams took Parkman on a tour of the city, showing him the sites that were involved in the siege, and particularly in a battle called the Battle of Bloody Run, in which British regulars sought refuge in a French farmhouse from Pontiac's supporters who were attacking them outside the fort. And that farmhouse where they sought refuge, ironically, had belonged to William's grandfather, Jacques Campeau. So Parkman became so enamored with this story and with the farmhouse, which amazingly was still standing in 1845, that he had a daguerreotype taken of it, an early form of photography, to use it, I suspect, as an aide memoir for when he returned to Massachusetts and began writing the book. So the daguerreotype still exists. It is in the Francis Parkman papers of the Massachusetts Historical Society. And not only is it this wonderful image of what colonial Detroit looked like, and we have very few images of what the city looked like in the colonial period. It also gives us an idea that the local French population was trying to regain some of the prestige and power and influence that it had had in Pontiac's day, because by the 1840s, it was a minority. It was a cultural, linguistic, and religious minority in the city that their ancestors had founded. So it's this marvelous example of this attempt by the French residents to return to the glory days. And of course, if you've read The Conspiracy of Pontiac, you know that Parkman was not actually interested in the French part of the story at all. It was really all about Pontiac the man. But nonetheless, it was this moment in Detroit's history when the French population tried to come back.
That was a fascinating story, and I'm sorry it didn't make your book. How did you decide what information to include in your book and which to exclude?
Well, it was really a matter of trying to put some boundaries on the project chronologically, and ultimately I decided to end the book in 1837, which is when Michigan attained U.S. statehood. And because this Parkman story takes place in the 1840s, it really was outside the scope of the book. So it's not dead in the water. I've turned it into an essay which will appear in a forthcoming edited volume. So it does live on, but it was awfully hard to axe it from the book.
Let's move into the time warp. This is a fun segment of the show where we ask you a hypothetical history question about what might have happened if something had occurred differently or if someone had acted differently.
The time warp. Historians can't predict the future, but they can speculate about what might have been.
Catherine, in your opinion, what might have happened if the June 11th, 1805 fire had not burned down most of Detroit? How would the history or the appearance of the city be different today?
I like to think that it would have been different, although the destruction may just have come later in the 19th century. As you know, the John Hancock Mansion in Boston was torn down in 1863, and only in the uproar over that incident did the movement to preserve the remaining buildings of Boston's colonial period really gain momentum. So we may just have seen destruction a few decades later, and after all, the buildings of colonial Detroit were not the solid brick construction of the Hancock Manor, but rather they're much more subject to the elements. But if Detroit's colonial structures had survived, it's hard not to think that the city would have been in touch with its modern history now. With the exception of a few street names and a few recipes that are still used at key times of the year, like during Lent, the French period is completely intangible now, and it's not in public memory. We might also say that about the Native period. The Native period is intangible. The British period is pretty intangible. Detroit's earliest surviving structure was built in 1826, so 125 years after Detroit was founded. So it's easy to imagine that Detroit could be something more akin to Quebec City or New Orleans and have an appreciation for its colonial history in a way that it just doesn't now. But interestingly, across the river from Detroit in Windsor, Ontario, that early history is comparatively more visible, especially in the French period. There are a few colonial period structures still standing. French is still somewhat spoken, and the history is more alive for the residents than it is for modern Detroit residents. So if that fire had not, in fact, occurred in 1805, we might have had a chance of seeing visual reminders of the city's early history in a way that we just can't now.
I'm having this image in my head as you're describing what Detroit might look like today if it hadn't burned down in 1805, of the new Chrysler commercials where they're driving the new fancy Chrysler to highlight Motor City, and then you might just pass like an old French building along with the city skyscraper.
That would be fantastic. And of course, it adds another dimension to the catchphrase that they were using a few years ago, imported from Detroit. And you might really get a sense of the history of that idea of importation with those 18th century buildings in the background.
Catherine, are you sticking around the Detroit area, or are you onto something else with your research?
Now I am working on a history of counterfeit goods in early America, and this book, which I've entitled An Empire of Fakes, was in fact in part inspired by the work that I did on moccasins at Detroit. As we were talking about a few minutes ago, as those moccasins manufactured in Detroit in the 18th century grew further and further removed from Native involvement, Native influence, Native patterns even, and became much more hybridized and much more European or Euro-American in form and in function, they turned into a kind of counterfeit good, if you will. They were marketed to East Coast people and also to the rest of the Atlantic world as something authentically frontier, something authentically native made, which of course they weren't at all. And on an interesting sidebar, that trend has continued with moccasins. The Minnetonka moccasins that we can buy from our local shoe stores now have absolutely nothing to do with the Minnetonka tribe. They're manufactured in China. So it's an interesting continuation of a process that actually is a couple of hundred years old. But nonetheless, that kind of counterfeiting that happened in Detroit got me thinking about other kinds of counterfeits in the Atlantic world in this period. And the short answer is they abounded. All kinds of goods in this period were counterfeited and put up for sale. And so this current project of mine is tracking those kinds of goods and helping us to rethink the economic doctrines that were in play in this period. We've tended to privilege mercantilism, which is the economic doctrine whereby an empire trades most predominantly with itself as a kind of zero-sum wealth game. If we can keep the wealth in our empire, then our competing empires won't have as much money. So that's how we tend to think about trade and commerce in the colonial period. And actually what I think counterfeit goods shows us is the opposite. We not only see much more inter-imperial interactions through counterfeiting, but we also see merchants and other kinds of commercial actors really working for personal or individual or selfish kinds of means, not for the good of the empire. So that's my current project that I'm working on.
That sounds fascinating and timely, since we see all those ads about, buy original, don't buy counterfeit. People are still doing it today. So it's in some ways fascinating to know it went on in early America. So we look forward to that project. Where is the best place to look for more information about you, how this counterfeit project is going, and how we can get in contact with you if we have more questions about Detroit?
Sure. Go to the University of Notre Dame's History Department's webpage.
Catherine, thank you so much for showing us that Detroit was not just an isolated backwater, but that it was in fact a cultured, well-connected, and cosmopolitan city, even in the early Republic and before.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
Located almost 600 miles inland from Philadelphia and over 700 miles from Quebec City, early Detroit could have been a backwater, a frontier post that Europeans established to protect its colonial settlements from Native American attacks. But it wasn't a backwater. Sure, it lay a long way from the Atlantic coast, but as Catherine revealed, Detroit became a cosmopolitan entrepôt not long after the Sieur de Cadillac established a French settlement there. Whether under French, British, or American political control, Detroit had all the imported European, Asian, West Indian, and East Coast goods you would expect to find in early Boston, New York City, Philadelphia, and Charleston. Early Detroit also serves as a fascinating place to study because it's where Native American, European, and Euro-American peoples intermixed and socialized with one another. This intermixing and socialization allowed Detroit to become a melting pot, a place where a distinctly American trade network and identity could form. You can find more information about Catherine, her book Frontier Seaport, plus everything we talked about today on the show notes page for this episode, benfranklinsworld.com/051. Did you know that you can now listen to Ben Franklin's World through the Ben Franklin's World app? For more information, visit benfranklinsworld.com/iOS or benfranklinsworld.com/Android. If you download the app, you can click links in the show description that will take you directly to the show notes page for each episode, and you can access Poor Richard's Club. Of course, you could receive the show notes in your inbox and gain access to Poor Richard's Club by texting BF World to 33444. This action will allow you to sign up for the Franklin Gazette directly from your smartphone or tablet device. Finally, were you surprised to learn that Detroit was a cosmopolitan city from its earliest days of European settlement? Share your answers with me. Email liz@benfranklinsworld.com, tweet me @LizCovart, or post your comments in the show notes page for this episode or in Poor Richard's Club.
And remember, never leave till tomorrow that which you can do today.